Welcome, everybody. It looks like we have quite a few folks from all over the area. My name's Cassie Sofing. I'm the Senior Science Educator for the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies and the Informal Science Lead for Globe Mission Mosquito. And I'm monitoring the background part of this webinar. And I'd like to have the rest of the panelists please introduce yourselves today.
Hi, I'm Dorian Janney, and I am the education lead for the Globe Mission Mosquito campaign. I see a lot of my friends on today and a lot of friends I haven't met yet. So greetings, nice to have everyone here.
Hi, I'm Rusty Lowe. I am I'm the campaign scientist and the scientist for Globe Observer Mosquito Habitat Mapper, and I'll be co-hosting this webinar with Peder.
I'm Peder Nelson, and I'm a researcher and instructor of geography and geospatial science at Oregon State University, and I help to lead the Globe Observer land cover tool and the science behind all of that. So I'm looking forward to sharing how we can work together between what is all inside Globe Observer.
Hi, and my name is Liz Burke. I am part of this team here today as a supporter of the project, and I am an education contributor.
Well, thank you, everybody. For those of you who are new to our webinars, we are using the Zoom webinar platform. And with that, it's a little different from a Zoom meeting. It's more of a delivery system, but that doesn't mean that you can't ask us questions. So there is a chat feature at the bottom of your window, and just all you have to do is send the message to the panelists and attendees, which is permitted. So be sure you're checking to, making sure it goes to everybody so that we can all answer and respond to your questions. If for any reason you need to leave the webinar, you're welcome to join right back in with the same link that you received in your email. And with that, we'll get started. Dorian, did you want to jump in here?
I certainly can.
Thank you.
So we're going to start off by giving our monthly mosquito observation update. We will look at the metrics from last month. Our featured topic today is Better Together, and we're going to be spotlighting the work that is being done by Joan Calope of the Philippines. And our featured resource is a blog, and we'll give you some upcoming webinar information. Next slide, please. Oh, thank you. So during the month of February, there were a total of 483 mosquito habitat mapper data submissions. From the beginning of the mosquito habitat mapper tool, which goes back to May 29th of 2017, to the end of February, and of course we did have that one extra day in February, there have been 20,915 mosquito habitat mapper data submissions. During the month of February, there were 28 identifications of larvae. So we know that's extra work, and we wanted to call that out. The pictures in there are of some of the high school students at the International School at Largo in Prince George's County Public Schools in Maryland, and they were working on some mosquito identifications in those pictures that you see there. Next slide, please. So I also like to call out and give a big thank you and hurrah to the folks who are the top data submitters for the entire month of February. So I keep weekly data, and then I take a look at that data and see for the entire month who are our just top data submitters. One of the things I love seeing when I look at this information is the different countries that we have people submitting data from. So as you can see here, our top data submitters for February tended to be in countries where they have active mosquito season. Although do remember that your data is important all the time, and we love to have at least pictures of your potential mosquito habitats when it's non-active season. So a huge thanks to all of the folks who are our top data submitters for the month of February. Next slide, please. Here I just have a map showing all of the places where data was submitted for the mosquito habitat mapper from the beginning, from 5/29/17 to the end of February. I hope you'll take a look at this map and one, see how awesome it is that we have data coming in from so many places, but also take note of the places where we don't have data being submitted. And if you know anyone who lives there, or if you should live there yourself, or if you should be traveling to any of those locations where our data is sparse, it sure would be great to start filling in that map some more. Of course, though, with this type of data, you can't have too much data. And it's super important. I'm sure Rusty and Peter will be talking about that when they start to talk to, to us about the importance of the land cover and the mosquito habitat mapper data. You really can't have too much data, particularly so that this data can be used by scientists and by public health officials. So let's keep it up, folks. Good job. Next slide, please. And I think now we're going to go ahead and segue over to Rusty and Peter.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Dorian. It is great to be here and to introduce our colleague, Peder Nelson. He works also with Globe Observer, as he just said. And we are very excited to begin a new initiative this year where we are trying to encourage as much as possible the collection of both mosquito habitat mapper data and land cover data using the app. And that's why we're calling this today Better Together. Next slide, please. Just as a reminder, in the chat, we were talking about some of the places where we're finding mosquitoes. Unfortunately, this is just a picture of the US, but you'll see that right now we are in mosquito season in the lower half of the continent in the lower half of the lower 48 of the US. And so we're looking to see more and more observations as time progresses. So take a look if you're in the US where you are and if you should begin to see mosquitoes. And you'll see in Maryland, yes, it's just about time according to our map. So that's pretty exciting. Let's go to the next slide. And for those of you who haven't been here before or don't know much about Globe Observer, you know, this is a citizen science app that is available for free online. And today we're focusing on the mosquito habitat mapper, which enables you to find, to locate and report where mosquitoes are found, what kind of mosquitoes you have identified, and also whether or not you're able to, if it's a container, to eliminate the breeding site. If you go to the next slide, what you will see is just the steps that take place in our app. You locate the app. With the app, you locate your study site. Then you describe what you see. You photograph specimens as well as photographing the site. And then we ask you to take one step further, use a magnifying device, see if you can't identify whether or not the genus that you see is from one of the 3 taxa that we're supporting with this app. And finally, we ask you if you have the ability to mitigate the site if it is a container. So these are what we've been asking for the past year with our Globe Mission Mosquito campaign. And the question is, okay, you're making these observations, you've put this data in, we see the map, now what do we do with that data? And that is actually that's the topic we're going to be talking about today. In the next slide, this is our research challenge. The call to action is we need to better understand the environmental and biological factors why we're seeing mosquitoes in remote sensing data. And there's a couple quotes here. Most of them are, within the last 10 years or so. But the most important thing to realize is that even though people are doing lots and lots of studies, they're still encouraging us to do many, many more studies looking at the relationship between mosquitoes and the data that we obtain from remotely sensing the land cover, because even though we understand there's a relationship, we still need to work on those methods. We still need to articulate what those specific variables are that are causing the patterns that we see. So that's the research challenge, and our tool can really help people take the whole scientific community a step forward in doing this. Let's take the next slide. Okay, Peder, I think you might want to start talking now about the land cover data that we have and what you see here.
Yeah, thank you for that, Rusty. I really appreciate that, the introduction and the opportunity to join this community to talk about what I do and my connection to mosquito habitat mapping and trying to understand that at a variety of spatial scales. So what I mean by that is here we're looking at some of the photos that were recorded using the Globe Observer mosquito habitat mapper, where some Peru citizen scientists actually identified potential water sources with potential larvae, mosquito larvae in them. And what we notice is that it's actually really small. It looks like a graded area that is you know, in a particular location, and we can actually see that there's only 2 or 3 observations that were on this map. So it's one of the questions is, how do we see mosquitoes from space? And really, we don't. Really, what we are detecting using NASA tools like the satellites that are recording images of Earth is that we actually are getting the environmental characteristics. So from space, we can actually see that this is a city. And if we look at this picture pretty deeply here, we see that there's a gray color that's associated with concrete. We see that the water color is actually a little bit green, not the blue that many of us think of when we think of water as land cover. And so, you know, this is the context of the type of data that is being submitted when you use solely the Globe Observer mosquito habitat mapping tool. And this information right here is really valuable for the scientists who are trying to help predict when we might actually see mosquitoes occur on the landscape. And some of that relates to temperature, which is something that we can actually measure from space, how hot the ground is. But also one of the characteristics is things like trees, which is why I decided to wear my tree shirt today, because trees are one of these places that do also provide habitat for mosquitoes. And so when we think about where we're finding mosquitoes or places that we might find mosquitoes, we really want to be thinking about the land cover that's around us. And land cover is made up of a variety of different ways of describing the surface, what's in that location. And so if we go to the next slide, what I wanted to show you is one of the tools that I use to look at locations in a systematic fashion. And this is a tool that, as you can see, was created and supported by a variety of organizations that are really concerned and about both mosquitoes and where the habitat associated with them, but also how that habitat is changing over time. And so you can see that NASA provides a lot of the satellite data that we're going to look at. But there's a variety of other groups that also do this. And so you might be familiar with using Google Earth or looking at satellite images when you are looking at mobile maps, when you're just trying to navigate around. And so this tool is one that we're hoping to be able to bring to this community so that you can actually understand what the satellite data view is, and we can provide a little bit more context to those really localized Great-like pictures that we were just looking at. That is primarily what is coming in with the mosquito habitat mapper. And so if we go to the next slide, we're able to take a look at one of these locations that was reported to have mosquito habitat. And it is at the location that was reported is actually the very center within that yellow box. And that yellow box represents a 100 meter by 100 meter area that is exactly about the scale that we're asking you to do and look at with the Globe Observer Land Cover tool. And so I wanted to highlight this because if we look at this satellite image that was taken from space, you can't actually see the grate. You can't actually see much of the detail of that particular mosquito habitat mapping location, right? It's actually in shadow by this really tall building that kind of goes off to a bit of an angle off to the right of your screen there. And so what we have to help us to characterize this location is not just the location where we're getting the mosquito habitat, but we want to kind of get that larger context, which is the size of the data that the satellites are providing us. And so you can actually see in here that we have buildings, we have some streets, we even have some trees and some canopy that actually stands up above the buildings that are in this location. And so this is what I spend a lot of my time doing, is looking at locations like this and then clicking on these little dots and then identifying what kind of land cover elements are in that location. And so you can see our legend that Dr. Rusty Lowe and I have developed for mosquito habitat locations. And it kind of starts off with our vegetation. You know, are there trees there? Are we seeing the tree canopy? Because remember, with satellites, we're looking straight down. And so we can't actually see what's underneath those tree canopy. So this is, again, why we actually need these pictures on the ground, whether they're coming from the mosquito habitat mapper, where you are identifying we're actually finding mosquitoes here or we're not finding mosquitoes in this location. That helps us to make this connection between what the satellite colors and what the satellite is recording with what is actually happening there on the ground. And so we have our vegetation, trees, brush or scrub, shrubby kind of things, grass areas like we like to walk around in, or that might be planted around buildings. But then we get into what we call impervious surface. So this is the roads, it's the buildings, it's a lot of these things that humans have put into these locations to build our own habitat, human habitat, which also tends to be great locations that mosquitoes like to take advantage of. And so we call those areas impervious surface because they can affect the way that water moves through the landscape. And as a result of that, you might have areas that actually pool water and then actually become mosquito habitat. And these are the things that we're looking out for, and we can actually mitigate. If we are thoughtful about the way that we organize our cities, the way that we build our infrastructure that humans do need, you know, we can actually possibly and hopefully reduce mosquito vectors and illnesses that come from our own misunderstanding or just the way that we have developed. And so as a result, you know, we also want to look at things like, you know, cultivated vegetation. Again, things that people are putting into the landscape, because those really can be, especially if we're irrigating, can then also become areas that are more moist, they're shaded, and so they tend to be really good mosquito habitat. And then we have people going into those landscapes. And so it becomes this potential vector into a community by the way that we actually cultivate our crops. But then we have kind of these
Peder.
Yeah.
Hey,
yeah,
I just wanted to interrupt. I know you always have said so many great things, and I just wanted to point out that, you know, besides the fact that this is the study area that we are using in our land cover, which is 100 by 100, when we talk about the Aedes species, the Albopictus and the Aegypti, that's really just about how far they also fly. And so this is actually a really, this can really tell you a whole lot about this region. So I just wanted to point out that there is a very nice area. We're talking about buffering the area around where you're going to find the mosquitoes. And this size is really good to look at. Okay, I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, that's really important because that is one of the characteristics that we're trying to understand when we look at a location like this is what is the habitat, or what how far can a species go within this 100-meter area? You know, is there enough water sources or other preferred habitat that allow something like the mosquito to actually move from one area of this 100-meter area to the other side? And if we could actually interrupt that, that does provide opportunities for mitigation. And so that is a big reason why I spend my time and click on all these little points and try to label them, and in particular look at the open water. Can we see the open water in a location like this? And I'll draw your attention to the lower right corner where there is this blue square that it could be mistaken, or it might actually be open water. From my eyes, it looks like a building that a roof that has been painted blue, in contrast to all the other brown or white sort of building tops. So this is actually a piece that sometimes can confuse satellite images if all you do is rely on that the visible part of light, which is what our eyes like to pick up on. And so helping us to actually know that even though it looks blue from above, in fact, this is a building. It is a really important piece that I, as somebody who is trying to map out where water is, that might be a confusing piece. And so that's a really important part about what we're doing, and how it's helpful to have this aerial view, but it's really more important as well to have on the ground measurements, reference data that help some of us who've never been to this location better understand what we're seeing from space. So I spent a little bit of time and went through all of these dots and labeled them. And before we go to the next slide, I'd just kind of like to take a moment and ask, how much of this area do you think is covered in impervious surface? From 0 to 100%. And just type that into the chat box. And I'm kind of curious, before I show you my results, how you guys might label this. All right, so we see one person mentioning 45%. Another with 85%. That's quite a variability right there, huh? 60%. All right, so we're starting, the average is right in there, 50 to 60%, with a low of 45 and a high of 85. All right, so yeah, so we're starting to get some higher numbers in there. All right. Well, thank you for indulging me in that, and keep typing that in. We'll kind of average those together, and which is the science that we do. Usually we don't make just one measurement. If I move these points around, I might come up with a different percentage. And so that is a characteristic of the science that we do. We like to have more than one measurement of locations. So if we go to the next slide, we have my interpretation here is around 96% if of all of these locations kind of add up to be about that amount. And so that's actually a really important number. And overall, this would be labeled as an urban area or a built up area or an area with 96% impervious surface. It's not 100%, as you can see. There are some trees inside of there. There's actually a little bit of bare ground, some dirt that's visible. And so, you know, I was able to identify about 3% of my samples here turned out to be tree canopy. And in fact, that is one of those things that looking at the other mosquito habitat mapping pictures that were submitted for this location, I could see in a couple of those pictures a little bit of a shadow from these taller trees, or even a little bit of green leaves kind of falling down in this area. And that shadow is in the canopy cover could be a really good explanation for why we're seeing kind of the green, the algae, and some of those sort of things in this particular water source. So that's how I use these really close photos that are getting submitted by Mosquito Habitat Mapper. But as you can see, you know, that small little area is maybe 1 meter wide by maybe 1 meter tall, maybe 2 meters. It's pretty small because you can actually see the person's knees in that location. So those knees actually give me a little bit of context and scale that help me to see how big that is. And so it's helpful when you're taking these pictures to include something like a ruler or something that helps us to actually understand a little bit of that scale and help other people 2 or 3 years from now maybe understand a little bit of the context of this location. So what's really neat is that, you know, we can go through as a community and go and look at all of these locations, and we can characterize all of those landscapes that have been submitted through the Mosquito Habitat Mapper in terms of the land cover. And that then becomes something that we can use to help us make better models and predictions for maybe where we would find other mosquito habitat in this particular area, but then also thinking about it globally, because this is a global tool. NASA collects data around the world using the satellite data, in particular, to give us systematic data. So watch for this tool and some of these locations starting to pop up. And we, if interested, let Dr. Rusty know about this, and we might be able to help you set up something particularly around the areas that you're working. And that would help me because I haven't been to this particular location in Peru. I'm sort of relying on my own understanding of what I've seen, what I've experienced, and bringing that mental model to this landscape. But it would be much better if we could have people in that location who really understand the size of this building, the type of material for these streets, all of these different sort of things that help to provide the local context, the local knowledge, but in a scientific fashion. So if we go to the next slide, what I wanted to show you is that, in fact, you know, NASA and our satellite data that is provided by NASA has been going on for, you know, anywhere from 1 to 2 years, all the way back to 1972. This particular satellite that I was able to get some information from actually helps us to see the NVVI. So this is the vegetation index, kind of how green is the landscape. And this is a common measurement that has been used for 40 years or so of using satellite data to monitor areas like crops in particular, or areas like forests. You know, all of that green vegetation that's out there, because we're seeing photosynthesis happening. And so what we actually see here is that it's not just a flat line for this location in Peru. In fact, the up and down that you see, kind of that jigsaw pattern, tells us something about when it's green and when it's not green. And so trying to relate this graph to that picture that I was just showing you is the challenge that I have. And it also helps us to see, you know, from the satellite point of view, when we might be expecting to see mosquitoes emerging in a location. And just by looking at this graph, I would expect that whenever we have the big spike, that in fact, that's actually when we might be seeing the green up in an area that would provide the right temperatures, as well as the moisture, which is that wetness one underneath, how moist is the landscape, all come together to help us make predictions about where we might be seeing mosquito habitat. But this is where your local information helps to provide the context to all of this sort of data that NASA is producing. Because for every one of these measurements on this graph, we actually have also the satellite picture and measurements that go along with this. And so this is the kind of information that we're working with to try to take these little local point measurements and locations that you guys many people are doing with the mosquito habitat mapper, but then to be able to look all the way across all of Peru and find me all the other locations that have the same high greenness in that NDVI, in this vegetation index, as well as areas that might be experiencing wetness at the same time. And what we found out from some very localized sort of research, we are finding that there are these certain characteristics. And so that might help you know where do you want to go set up your mosquito traps, or where do you want to look for mosquitoes in particular locations, and maybe where you need to do some mitigation with this. So this is what I spend a lot of my time doing, and I hope that you guys, people on this call, will actually join me in starting to think about not only whether you're finding a mosquito or not, but then helping to characterize the landscape around it. So if we go to the next slide, there's a really wonderful tool that NASA has put together that allows you to start looking at the satellite data that is available. And so if you go to this website, which is worldview.earthdata.nasa.gov, or just go and search for Worldview, you'll find this wonderful tool that NASA provides some of their satellite data. And you can see that there is actually some stories that go along with this. And so, you know, they can help provide a little bit of context, what's happening on Earth right now. But if you go to this, you can actually search and find information such as greenness, how green is an area. But there's a lot of information that helps you to provide the context and see the NASA's view of Earth right here. So I encourage you to go and explore, see what type of information is there, because there is information such as surface temperature. How warm is this location? You can actually see that Earth at night is a really interesting one because it does provide some context about population, and that there are actually cities in this location, or heat that might provide habitat for mosquitoes, actually. And so that Earth at night is kind of a different view of Earth than what we normally have. But that all goes back to the land cover that's there. We would rarely see an area that is lit up at night if it doesn't have people putting street lights out or things like that. Usually we see that black area. So there's a lot of information there, and I really encourage you, as you're thinking about where would I go and look for mosquito habitat, this might be one place that you can get some context. And so with that, let's go to the next slide. And so I wanted to show you that if you, after you do a mosquito habitat mapping identification, you maybe do your dip and you collect some larvae, what's actually useful is to go to the next protocol that's right underneath mosquito habitat called land cover. And this allows you to take pictures in the north, east, south, west direction, as well as up, right up to the satellite. So you're getting a view of the satellite. And so here we can actually see the canopy, the tree canopy that somebody took, that we would actually be seeing from above. And then importantly, we're getting the context of what the ground conditions look like. So in this case, we see the leaves of the tree that have actually fallen on the ground, as well as the green landscape. In another location, we might actually see that grate that I showed you earlier in that first one. And so providing a little bit of that context in the 100-meter direction, can we even see 100 meters? That's one of these questions that is really important, that helps us to describe that landscape. And so if you go through and do that, you can actually start making your own land cover map by labeling what you see in each one of these directions. And there's a nice tutorial that walks you through doing this. And so that allows you to start thinking about not only where you're finding mosquitoes, but maybe where you're not finding mosquitoes. And you as a community can actually start building your own personalized map and not rely on NASA or other people to provide all of this to you. You can start taking control over your own data and your own location. So if we go to the next slide, this is some of the information that's coming up, and you can start to see this combination on this globe visualization site where we can start to see how land cover occurs in some places as mosquito habitat. We would like to encourage you to do these two things at once because of the different spatial scales as well as the different information that we're getting with this. So Dr. Lowe, can you expand on what we're seeing here?
Just got to unmute first. Sure. So what you will see here are a number of points where we have either land cover classifications or mosquito breeding sites. And this is not a terribly good map because if you look down in Texas, for instance, you'll see that if you have quite a few mosquito habitats, you can begin to see that triangle. But in a lot of the places we have here, you really can't discern what we're seeing here. But the point is that what we would like to see right now, we have lots of land cover points. We also have lots of mosquito breeding site points, but they aren't always co-located. And as Peder has just emphasized, there is a lot of really rich analysis that's available for your community, for your students, for NASA scientists that we can begin to support by collecting both sets of data in one place. And in many cases, that just means spending an extra 5 or 6 minutes once you do a mosquito habitat observation to actually open up the land cover app and do a observation of the land cover at the same place. So we're really hoping that this year will be the year that we're going to begin to get that going in our community. Thanks, Peder.
So let's go to the next slide. So this is, here are a couple locations where you can start looking at the Globe Observer data and a little information about how to download that data, how to access it, how to visualize it in that same sort of map that was just shown. And then there's the Worldview site. As I mentioned earlier, there is a lot of information here. And so if you are interested in what your area looks like from NASA's view, this is a really good place to start looking at that. But one of the things that pops up as scientists is also understanding where there isn't any information or where there isn't data, right? Because that then becomes a great research project for you. If other people have already collected data there, well, it's useful to go back to those locations and do repeat observations, but it can be also really helpful to start seeing where we're seeing variability or where there's some differences between where you've collected some data in the urban areas usually compared to maybe some other locations that you might be able to understand a little bit better with this NASA view of things. So these resources are available, and that's one of the nice things is comparing what you see to what NASA sees of Earth. All right, so next slide, please. So with that, I will turn it back to Dr. Lowe, and I hope that you enjoyed learning a little bit about land cover.
That's really cool. Thank you, Peder. So what we just want to say here is that there are a lot of studies that have been done, and it's really interesting. If you look at the literature, you do a literature review, what you will see is that in the 1950s and the 1960s and 70s, there was a lot of data a lot of research that was done on where to find mosquito habitats. And then there was a shift in the literature where people began to do a lot more spraying. And so there was a lot less of this fundamental research because our solution was, oh, we can just spray everywhere. What we are finding now by looking at these microhabitats is that we really do need to know, statistically speaking, where we want to find these habitats so we don't inundate the landscape with too much spray. And so what you will be seeing if you take a look is that in the last maybe 10 years, there's a lot more research now that's being done about, once again, trying to describe these habitats. So the research that we're doing, as you saw in our call to action, there's a lot of interest now in the science community to do this fundamental research about where we find mosquito oviposition sites, where the larvae grow, and how close they are, and what kind of context there are with respect to land cover and also environmental variables. So if we move to the next slide, it's time for our spotlight.
All right, and if we go to the next slide, so we are going to be looking at our spotlight from Joan, and she is from Quezon City in the Philippines. Next slide. She is a teacher at the Batasan Hills National High School, located on IBP Road in the Batasan Hills, Quezon City. It happens to be the largest school in that city and has about 16,000 students. My goodness, that is absolutely humongous. It covers junior and senior high school students, so 7th to 12th grade, 10 to about 19 years old. They use the Mosquito Habitat Mapper app, or tool as we call it. We kind of have figured out how to differentiate by saying that it is the Globe Observer app, and it has 4 tools, one of which is land cover, and one of which is the Mosquito Habitat Mapper. So the Mosquito Habitat Mapper tool is being used by teachers and students and other Globe schools that are in the Philippines. They introduce it through trainings, they do research activities and community activities and lesson plans using the Mosquito Habitat Mapper. And they also use it as a tool for research and as an aid in their teaching. So really nice to see some of the ways in which this tool and the resources are being incorporated in various settings, including formal and informal education settings. Next slide, please. So some of the things that they do a lot of identification of the larvae. They do have mosquitoes a lot during their school year, and they also have different mosquito transmitted diseases there, including dengue. Joan had said to me was of great concern. So they use a macro lens, 60 to 100 times, and they use smartphones. They have to help the students learn about the proper collection of the larvae. And then the students learn about the different kinds of larvae, focusing on those 3 key taxa, the Anopheles, the Aedes, and the Culex, which are the taxa that we focus on with this tool. They look at the life cycle and behavior of mosquitoes. Really neat way to introduce biological concepts and the whole idea of life cycle and then things like metamorphosis by looking more specifically at mosquitoes. We often think of butterflies and moths, but not always mosquitoes. Focusing on the mosquito-borne diseases as well as Globe resources and the website. Next slide, please. So they, for collecting the larvae, they prepare the materials for the collection and identification. They follow those 4 steps that are in the Mosquito Habitat Mapper tool. So the first one is, of course, identifying potential mosquito habitats. If you happen to find some larvae, eggs, see any adults, any pupa, you can do a sample and count. If you happen to have one of those magnifiers and some larvae, you can go ahead and do an identification. And then, of course, when possible, empty out the water. And then super important is they upload the data using the Mosquito Habitat Mapper tool. And next slide. So the common larvae that they're finding in the Philippines are Aedes aegypti and Aedes albopictus. Every now and then they're finding Culex as well. They're finding that once they get used to doing it, it's actually fairly easy to identify the larva using the Globe mosquito larva identification chart. Another really good best practice is you're going to find that sometimes when you're, well, often when you're trying to identify your larva, they're very, very wiggly. So one of the things that they found is if you put in a small amount of alcohol, you can also use hand sanitizer, then that will stun or slow down your larva, and then it's much easier to manipulate it. Sometimes we also suggest you use a toothpick to kind of move it around a little bit so that you can get the siphon, the part of it that you're interested in taking photographs of, nice and close up. Next slide, please. So why do they use it? Well, they find that it's very easy to use. It's convenient. It's all right there in your smartphone. Nice way of showing how to kind of do a STEM interdisciplinary activity because you're using your science, your technology. It took engineering to do this. And of course, you're collecting data using numbers, and that's mathematics. Very user-friendly. You've got your real-time uploading of data. And just to remind folks who maybe haven't used this tool, you can collect data without internet connectivity, and it's later when you're submitting your data that you need to have internet connectivity. You do have a step-by-step approach, which minimizes the errors, and it provides feedback. It will tell you right away, thank you for submitting. You have identified so many mosquito habitats and eliminated a certain number. So it really is it does give you some nice instant gratification. Next slide. All right. So thank you so much to Joan. I am going to send her a certificate of appreciation. And if any of you out there are using the Mosquito Habitat Mapper tool with any types of audiences, we really like to share the diversity of different audiences with whom this tool is being used. Please get in touch with me. I'll put my email in there. I'm Dorian Janney, and let me know. And we would love, love, love to feature you and the work that you're doing and your participants. So thank you so much.
Great. You want to go to the featured resource? Okay, fantastic. Here is a blog that was developed by Peder and myself, talking about geolocation accuracy tips. You can read this online on our on the Mission Mosquito website. The cool tip is that if you actually first take a land cover measurement, because there is an ability to identify what the accuracy of the measurement is, you can actually collect that, and then we will have that estimate of accuracy also for the Mosquito Habitat Mapper. So just wanted to let you know this blog just came up this week, and we would love to have you take a look at it and tell us what you think about it. Peder, I would like you now to make the offer orally about what we'd like people to do with the Collect Online tool, the Collect Earth Online tool. So go ahead and talk about this opportunity that we're providing to people on the webinar today.
Yeah, so since I spent a lot of time kind of going over a new tool that I think it could be really informative for you, we would like to see if you'd be interested in looking at some of these locations. And if you are, send a note to Dr. Rusty Lowe. The email is in the chat, and we will help get you set up with a location. And you know, on that tool, and we'll have a little video that kind of walks you through how to interpret, how to do exactly what I showed you in this webinar. And what would be great is if you have a particular mosquito habitat location, mapper location that you've submitted, you know, to help us know what the site ID or what the location number is. A latitude, longitude also works for us. But it would be great to have you start looking at some of these locations using the satellite data that we have available to us through NASA and a variety of very useful and helpful organizations.
Right. Dorian, we'll be able to send out an email after this webinar to the participants to give them some instructions how to participate and how to obtain some of the satellite imagery for one of their sites. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, Rusty. I will definitely be sending out an email after this. Are you going to be including that information for how they can do that at their sites?
Yes, that's what I'd like to do. So hold off until I get that information to you from Peder.
You got it.
Thank you so much.
Our next webinar would be April 2nd at 2 p.m. Eastern Time again, and it's the perfect time to introduce you and your students to the Globe Observer Tree Campaign. And we'll be highlighting connections between mosquitoes, trees, and Earth Day. On our website, and I put the link to the Science Cafe, but once you're to the Science Cafe, you can find our webinar announcements. But in order to help us kind of find out more about you, we'd like to discover your connection to Earth Day. What sparks your interest to participate? How would you celebrate? And why is Earth Day important to you? And we have just a little Google form for you to kind of enter that information in, and we'd like to share it during the webinar. So please sign up and register for the next webinar and then get your information into the Google form for us for Earth Day. That's April 2nd at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And with that, we're at the tail end of our webinar for this month. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. All of the panelists will stay on for a few minutes to answer your questions. But we appreciate you spending your Tuesday afternoon with us. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Cassie. And there were 2 or 3 questions about where to find information about lesson plans. And you can find them on our website. Here are also listed a couple of the resources that we have for K-12 and university and graduate students that we have collaborated with in the development.
And you can also go to observer.globe.gov and find our mosquito landing page with our toolkit. You can download resources there as well.
Okay, are there any other questions for our guest speaker?
Well, I'm looking forward to getting coordinates or locations from people so that we can give you that aerial view, which is a fun way of starting to look at your landscape. So please make sure that you do send a location or 2 to Dr. Lowe, and so we can get a fun project put together and analyze some views from above. Thank you all for coming and yeah, giving us some great information and your interest in this.
Well, thank you for taking your time out of your day, Peder, to present for this webinar, and we look forward to having you again soon as our featured speaker.
And before we jump off, Dorian, would you mind mentioning the tree campaign, which begins in April?
Sure. So we're having a tree campaign. It's going to be the entire month of April. We'll start on April 1st and end, of course, on April 30th. And we're going to be focusing on taking as many tree measurements as you can, helping us to better understand trees all around the world. There have been many webinars, and there's also a website. I will actually see if I can find that. Unfortunately, I wasn't quite prepared. So let's see if I can find that easily.
Sorry to throw that one at
you. Know what? I will include that in email that I send. All about the Around the World campaign. And Peter's very involved in that as well, so I'm sure he could also give us information.
Yes, I'm helping to run the student research campaign that is related to trees around the globe. And that, again, we have a tool within there, and trees are a big mosquito habitat. So as we think about trees and the connection to mosquito habitat, this is one of those characteristics that we really want to be thinking of and be considering. And whether you use the land cover tool to capture the landscape, or whether you estimate tree height using the Globe Observer tree tool, that all comes together and helps us to provide that context for what we are looking for with the mosquito habitat mapper. So April is going to be a fun time to think about how tall the trees are in your location, maybe how old those trees are, and to provide a little bit more of that context. So help us to map out as many trees as you can and help us to understand the landscape that covers the globe. Thank you.
And when you join us for our next webinar on April 2nd, we will be talking all about that, and you'll hear from the lead campaign manager, Brian Campbell, about this Trees Around the World campaign. So we look forward to having you join us, Trees Around the Globe.
All right, with that, thank you. I'll stop the recording and